This week sees the opening of the new Hollywood film, Selma, which centres on events in the United States 50 years ago, and the march from Selma to Montgomery, the culmination of the campaign to end segregation against black people in the southern states of America. Here is a trailer from the film, followed by footage of the police response to the first march on Montgomery.
He's got supporters. Detroit, New York, Los Angeles, inciting large-scale arrests and sympathy marches.
I'm very aware of that, Mr.
Selma is a major Hollywood blockbuster. The British star David Oyelowo plays Martin Luther King.
Mr. President, Dr. King is here.
Comedy Joe Gould plays his wife, Corina, and two British actors play central roles. Tim Roth as the reptilian, racist governor of Alabama, George Wallace, and Tom Wilkinson as President Lyndon Baines Johnston. The film is enjoying critical success across America and now in Britain.
We will not tolerate agitators attempting to orchestrate a disturbance in this state.
It is unacceptable that they use their power to keep us voiceless. Those that have gone before us say no more.
I'm worried about your safety. People actually say they're gonna kill our children.
The man stands up only to be struck down. We built the path as we came, rock by rock. The sail is probably bugged. It probably is.
We must march. We must stand up.
You march those people into rural Alabama, it's gotta be open season.
May I have a word?
There's no word to be had.
There are 70 million people watching. These pictures are going around the world.
We must make a massive demonstration.
You've seen people travel across the country to attend tomorrow's march, mostly white.
I heard about the attack of innocent people. I couldn't just stand by.
Looks like an army out there.
This revolution goes on and on. This revolution goes on and on.
Mine eyes have seen the glory, glory, hallelujah.
What happens when a man stands up, says enough is enough?
This revolution goes on and on.
We must be free. They say that freedom is a constant dying. They say that freedom is a constant dying. They say that.
And joining me to discuss both the film and its relevance to the United States today are the American-born writer, broadcaster and playwright Carol Gould, the British-based American activist, writer and academic Susan Butler, and Amandla Thomas-Johnson, a British-based activist and writer. Welcome. Susan, we were watching their footage from the film of the attack on the first march in Selma, but also original footage. Watching that 50 years on as a young black American, what does that say to you?
When I see that footage, I feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the people who stood up to these incredibly lethal and powerful forces. It also reminds me of the sentiment, this is what democracy looks like, because it's, I think, important to remember that legislation had been in place that would ostensibly allow black men to vote since 1870, and there should have been universal suffrage for women since 1920. But Jim Crow racism put barriers to that, and really, in order to win real, actual voting rights, the kind of which were cemented in 1965, they had to take the battle to the streets.
Now, Carol, like me, you remember the original footage, and I think you were involved in the civil rights activity as well. I mean, what impact did that have on you at the time?
Well, I wasn't involved because I was a child, but I remember it vividly. Also because my parents were involved in the civil rights movement long, 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 long before this. My mother was an activist in the 1930s at the Department of Public Assistance in Philadelphia, trying to do something about the appalling way in which African Americans were treated, living in the most appalling slums. And then she joined the U.S. Army in World War II and was horrified by segregation and by the fact that, for example, at Camp Pickett, Virginia, the German and Italian POWs were given the run of the camp, but the African American GIs and WACs were basically confined to barracks. And I couldn't even say on this program some of the words that were used to describe the African American GIs and WACs by the white GIs. And I've heard all of these stories from my mother, wrote a play about it, I'm writing a book about it. So it goes back generations. But as you say, you're grateful to the people who did participate in the movement. And when I look at it now, it feels as if it was yesterday. In fact, I wrote another play called Selma Was Yesterday. And the thing that I find lamentable is that right now in 2014-15, we have terrible problems again in the United States with young people being shot, being beaten up in northern states. So the racism hasn't, quote, ended in the U.S. It is still a major problem, and it's been on the front pages of all the papers and on television for the past 6 months because of a tremendous upsurge in racial tension in the United States. So sadly, it's not over.
I mean, Amandla, you come from a British black background, your parents came from the Caribbean. I mean, watching that, what impact did that have on the wider black community around the world at the time?
It would have had a massive impact. We have to realise at this point that many black peoples were living under, imperialism, in colonies in Africa, and in the Caribbean. The winds of change, so to speak, had not fully blown open the doors of that imperialism. And seeing this within a country that has had a reputation for democracy and freedom, seeing this within its ranks would really have, in many ways, emboldened people, but also shocked them as well as to the double standards that the Americans and the West, in particular, were operating under.
I mean, I think that's the point about the film. Many people watching this would still be difficult to imagine, but in 1965, around the world, America was still kind of seen as John F. Kennedy, the symbol of democracy. And to watch the reality of this, with dogs being unleashed and peaceful civil rights demonstrators, this man, George Wallace, an open racist, I mean, this was a shock to people that this was the reality of the United States.
Really, I think one of the real drivers of the civil rights movement in the 1960s was the dissonance between the rhetoric of this country founded on Enlightenment qualities of equality, freedom, social justice, and its foundation as a place built on chattel slavery. And indeed, the March on Washington was the centenary of the Emancipation Proclamation. And so, once again, we're looking back on these anniversaries, asking ourselves how much has changed since these major civil rights milestones, and seeing that the answer is too often not enough.
I mean, that's an interesting point. I mean, John F. Kennedy was held up as being a symbol of liberal America, but actually his record on civil rights wasn't that good. Surprisingly, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who we saw in that trailer, his career was overshadowed by Vietnam, but actually had a better record.
Yes, and of course Lyndon Johnson lost the South forever for the Democrats because the Southern Democrats, the Dixiecrats, were actually very conservative, very right-wing. And when he supported and pushed for the Civil Rights Act, ever since then, most states in the South have gone Republican. And the irony of that is the founder of the Republican Party was Abraham Lincoln. So there's some really strange dissonances in American history. But Lyndon Johnson stuck to his guns. He was absolutely determined to finish the work that JFK might have started. As you say, JFK, John Kennedy, didn't have such a great record, but Johnson was determined. It isn't shown as strongly in the film as it could be, but Lyndon Johnson was absolutely determined, at whatever risk to his reputation and to the Democratic Party, to bring about fully implemented civil rights. And then there's the other irony, which is we have an African-American president. And I remember seeing Barack Obama. If I may tell this anecdote, in 2004 in Philadelphia, he was a member of the Illinois state legislature, and he was running for U.S. Senate. And he gave a speech in Philadelphia and mentioned that there were some older men, gray-haired, white-haired men handing out Obama leaflets to support him. And one of his aides said, those guys, when they were youngsters, were Ku Klux Klansmen. And I don't know why, it just made me cry. I thought, well, that also is a kind of sort of an earthquake shift, a seismic shift in the U.S., but we're not there yet.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because, I mean, you mentioned the winds of change. I mean, Britain was seen as being the imperial power for many people around the world, and it's hard to remember this, but in the 1950s and 1960s, America was seen as different. It was seen as democratic. It didn't have that colonial past. It must have come as a shock to people, both in the Caribbean and Britain, to see this happening. I mean, to see those a film of people being treated like this in Alabama.
I think up to a certain point, America was seen as a beacon of democracy, because we have to also realise that many of the progressives, such as Claudia Jones, such as C.L.R. James, they'd actually been deported from the US, under an era called McCarthyism, where many leftists were targeted
during the Cold War.
During the Cold War, in a period of of tensions between East and West. So, though there was a popular image, I think, of the States at the time, there was also another image of it being very hard, very conforming and wishing to come down hard on leftists. I think also as well the point about there's a lot more work to be to be done. This interesting point about this piece of legislation, which was one after Selma, is that much of it has actually now been repealed. The Voting Rights Act, one of the key sections, Section 4, I think, has now been repealed, opening obviously some of the southern states up for discrimination. So that's quite an interesting thing. 50 years on, some may say we've had a step backwards at the same time.
I want to come back to what's happening in the United States today, but first I want to look at another extract from the film, which is looking at the character of Martin Luther King, central to the film, which I also think is a fascinating portrayal in the film, subject to some controversy. So let's look at this.
As long as I am unable to exercise my constitutional right to vote, I do not have command of my own life. I cannot determine my own destiny, for it is determined for me by people who would rather see me suffer than succeed. Those that have gone before us say, no more, no more. That means protest, that means march, that means disturb the peace, that means jail, that means risk, and that is hard. We will not wait any longer. Give us the vote. That's right, no more. We're not asking, we're demanding. Give us the vote.
Carol, do you think this does justice to Martin Luther King, and just what was the impact of King's rhetoric at the time?
Oh, he was a monumental figure in American life at the time, and I do remember his August 28th, 1963 speech, which was a couple of months before the assassination of Kennedy, because I remember my mother sitting me down and making sure that we all watched his I Have a Dream speech. And he became a figure in American life before that, in the 60s, during the time Kennedy was president. I think David Oyelowo's performance is out of this world. I mean, I'm a BAFTA member, and to me that is a winning performance.
But he's not going to get an Oscar,
I thought he
is he?
was. No. I find the nominations this year, that's another program that you should do, because I've been a member of BAFTA for 33 years, and I have never seen such a bizarre list of nominations on both sides of the ocean. But I thought he got Martin Luther King's personality, his spirit, to a T. I mean, others may disagree, but I thought he was superb, and I felt as if I was seeing Martin Luther King coming alive again. He really got under his skin, and I don't know why people criticize it, but perhaps it's just a subjective viewpoint.
No, Susan, I mean, King has become a sort of icon of American life, but the interesting thing about him, and it comes out a little bit in this film, particularly towards the end of his life and his assassination, he was becoming more radical. And he was speaking out against the Vietnam War, he was becoming quite militant in his tactics, and that's something which is not usually talked about so much, is it?
No, it's not, and there was a marked decrease in his general popularity among the American population towards the end of his life. I think King's legacy is in a way, kind of stuck between these two poles. In one sense, he can be read as too liberal, too assimilationist, wanting to win a series of small battles within the established status quo, needing to win politics over to his side. At the same time, you can see this very, I think, constructive evolution of his political consciousness away from small victories within the status quo to really understanding that a system predicated on exploitation will never be one that can accommodate equality and social justice.
I mean, that's interesting because he was prepared to work with more radical forces as he progressed, wasn't he, Amandla?
Absolutely. I think what's important about King's evolution, his political evolution, is that by the end of his life, as you mentioned, 1967, he really came out sort of against the Vietnam War. And it was this linking of international struggles to the internal struggle of African American people that he really brought together. Others, such as Malcolm X, had spoken about this vociferously for many years before. I think also as well, there's always this tendency to link, for example, Barack Obama with Martin Luther King. Back in 2007, on the campaign trail, actually in Selma, Barack Obama made a speech saying that we are the Joshuas, alluding to the Old Testament here. That Moses, i.e. Martin Luther King, has led them up to the mountain, and Joshua is going to be the person who leads African American people into Jerusalem. And Barack Obama is really saying that he is one of the Joshuas as well. So this connection between King and Obama has been made time and time again. But I actually think that by the time King was assassinated, his politics were radically different from the sort of politics Barack Obama espouses today.
And that's an interesting point. I want to come on to fast forward really to events in the United States, which you've alluded to. We've seen the terrible events in Ferguson, the killing of a young black man. We've also seen the killing of Eric Gardner in New York. We've seen a real re-rise of a protest in the United States over that. How much has changed in the US 50 years on, Carol?
Sadly, I think we came to a halt with this situation, and in fact, much before that, with Trayvon Martin being killed by a village vigilante who basically got off pretty much scot-free, and that we are seeing a kind of backward move of white juries, of police getting really feeling as if they have carte blanche to beat up and kill African American and minority young people and older people who, someone who's holding a pack of cards and suddenly is being shot because he was trying to a toy gun
playground.
And this is worrying. I can't, because I live in Britain, I can't work out where it's coming from, because those of us of my generation and my parents' generation who fought so hard for civil rights feel that we're on a retrograde in the United States. And it isn't an irony that with an African-American president that this situation is arising. And there's some African-Americans who say he's just weak. He just isn't standing up for his community the way he should. And he treads a very thin line there on how radical he can get.
Susan, how do you see it?
I think that one of the key differences between Martin Luther King and Barack Obama is that Martin Luther King was a leader and Barack Obama is a politician. And the issue of accountability, I think, is one that keeps coming up in my mind. I think that American politics is now so corporatized that politicians are essentially accountable to corporate capitalism rather than accountable to the electorate, or they're accountable to the electorate in a kind of secondary and peripheral way. Therefore, I don't think that we can actually look to the Oval Office to do anything more than to sort of buttress corporate capitalism globally, and anything else they do is sort of extracurricular, in a sense.
You were saying things were going retrograde in the United States. I mean, do you want to explain that?
Yeah, I think that now that we have a black man in the Oval Office, it's easy for us to think that racism has been conquered, it's been vanquished, and the struggle is all over. And I think that for many people, that's been the attitude. It's been 50 years. civil rights movement. Now we've had a black man in the White House, and that's it. And many people try and say that, that this really is a fulfillment of Martin Luther King's dream, black kids, white kids, and all that sort of stuff. But I just don't really think it's true. We look at the United States, and yes, we've had a lot of publicity about recent police shootings, but in actual fact, it's actually just publicity. These things have been going on for the last 50 years, but there's just been increased media attention to some of these things.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. I'd like to thank my guests, Carol Gould, Susan Butler, Amandla Thomas-Johnson. Thank you for joining us, and we're going to go take out with another extract from the film. Thank you.
Oh, my Lord. What you got us into, woman? We got 128 miles to come to our senses, gentlemen.
Hush. This here's the place we need to be. This right here is the next great battle.
I can only imagine. Decent looking place to die, though.